Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Simsbury Public Television. We are happy to have you here with us this evening as we present our historical awareness on race. My name is Lloyd Huey, and will be one of your presenters for this series. Along with us is Carol Clark Flanagan.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here and very excited for the launch of this 4-part series every Wednesday in February to do, as Lloyd has already said, to teach and to encourage a historical awareness of race. We'd like to thank the co-sponsors of this series, the Simsbury Public Library, whose room we are in this evening, and the Spirit Council. A few names need to be mentioned. Lindsay, who is the library liaison to the Spirit Council, has been amazing coordinating this, getting all sorts of programming together for us. And now she's out on maternity leave, so we also want to thank Chris Carney, who is holding the reins while she's out, and he was here helping us make sure that this show would go on. We'd like to thank Simsbury Community Television so much for being a new partner in this and for streaming this live for us. Thanks to all of your volunteers. And Patrick Fallon, who in his incredible patience has navigated some last-minute tech challenges. So thank you, Patrick. I would also like to particularly acknowledge the incredible work that Cheryl Cook and Nicole Kodak have done as co-chairs of the Spirit Council.
Yes.
In particular, this would not have happened if they had not persisted and taken care of so many of the details behind the scene. In particular, Nicole has been working tirelessly to get us to do all that we're supposed to do when we're supposed to do it. She has an incredibly positive attitude, plan A, plan B, plan C, and we want to thank her very much for her tireless work. It would not have happened without her, and her enthusiasm is palpable.
Yes.
We would like to begin by reading a land acknowledgement, and I am going to read that for you here. We would like to begin by acknowledging the land that is now the town of Simsbury, on which we gather, is the territory of the Weetag and Masako peoples, who have stewarded this land through the generations. We further recognize the Weetag Masako people's migration to Salisbury, Connecticut, alongside the Tunxis tribes after Metacom's rebellion. The Weetanuk, Pequot, Putatuk, Tunxis, and Mohican peoples came together along the Housatonic River, creating the contemporary Scotticook Nation. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Contrary to what most people think, history is not something of the past, nor is it a fixed narrative. It's fluid and malleable. It evolves over time. Our examination of it changes it. African-American history scholar Elizabeth Anderson explains why we must study Black history, not as a discussion or awareness of a bygone era, or the burden of too long a memory, but because, as she says, Black lives in America are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and political arithmetic entrenched centuries ago. We study Black history to understand the legacy of slavery. And the aftermath of slavery is with us today. It manifests itself in the Black community in many ways. Skewed opportunities, poor access to healthcare and education, incarceration, premature death, and impoverishment. Now, what does it mean to learn about a marginalized history living in a town like Simsbury? A town that celebrates proudly its long history going back to the very early colonial period as Eurocentric. Simsbury is more than 90% white. That didn't happen by mistake. So we need to purposely make room, make a place for this marginalized history. We can't just feel bad about slavery for a minute or about the horrific chapter in our nation's history. We have to avoid a binary view of this historical narrative as good or bad. History is complicated. It's really messy. It's very important that we incorporate this conversation in our national dialogue. It's also important that we've already started, and there's been enormous pushback, as I'm sure you're aware of, and that's to be expected, and we need to forge ahead. We need to embed this in our curriculum. Well, I'm a teacher, and when I think of it, I think of elementary school children, middle school children, high school young adults. They need to be able to see themselves in the curriculum. They need to understand their history and understand why it has been marginalized and almost totally neglected. We have to also resist lumping all of Black history under one label or in 1 month. The stories, the history, the narratives are rich and diverse. It is not one story of victimhood. There are stories of courage and compassion and innovation and activism. And we must see that diversity. We must recognize it. We must understand it, and we must embrace it. We need to do a reckoning of our own past. To not learn about it and not talk about it perpetuates systemic racism. Willful ignorance damages us all. We must accept the consequences of learning about this and have a holistic view of understanding and seeing this legacy in our society today. And we must commit ourselves to act to promote equity and social justice for all Americans, particularly for Black Americans. Learning about this, and this is important, will shine the light on our own history, on the history we have been taught. And learning about this will shine a light on our own identity as Americans. That's going to be hard, really hard. Why wouldn't it be?
Thank you, Carol. So, Martin Luther King said that we must learn to live together as brothers, or we will perish together as fools. You know, as we look around in our country, in our communities, in our world today, we are living in a time where it seems as if we're doing more to destroy ourselves instead of learning to live together as brothers. When we look, we use guns, we use drugs, we use media, false information, just to name a few of the ways that we use to destroy ourselves. The goal of our presentation and this discussion is not to create a sense of guilt or shame, but to create awareness of where we are as a society, how we got to this place, and what we can do to move to a better place. We will try to come up and help to find some of the root causes that has gotten us to where we are today. So today, as you look at our schedule, we're doing the introduction, and then we will talk about the Reconstruction period. Next week, we will pick it up with Jim Crow, and we'll go through black codes and a few other topics. The third week, we will do Indigenous People, Hispanic American history, and Asian American history. And then on the fourth week, we will talk about the origins of wealth and income inequality. We're going to talk about visualizing institutional and systemic bias, and we will get to the power of proximity. Where do we go from here, and how can we help to make our world a better place? So what are our expectations? We're hoping that we'll create greater awareness of where we are and how we got here, and increase understanding that will allow us to broaden our circles and have greater influence on those in our circle. Most of all, I want and I hope that we will create a greater awareness that the sum of us is greater than just some of us. Thomas Jefferson wrote that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we will take a look at how we've done, how we're doing, and how we're doing with this declaration. So why is racial awareness important to us? Many years ago, the decision was made to segregate people based on the color of their skin. This created an environment of discrimination, prejudice, and just challenges within our society. So we hope that by doing this racial awareness, a greater number of us will have a better understanding of the experience of others who are different, and how those experiences does not cause those people to be less than or better than themselves. The other thing we hope to address is, why is this of critical importance to the Simsbury community in general, and to us as a country, and each one of us individually? You know, as Carol said earlier, Simsbury is a primarily white community, and like the Farmington Valley and so many suburban communities, most of these communities are primarily white. And oftentimes, because of that, and because of the abundance of opportunities in these communities, folks who live in these communities can think that these opportunities are the same wherever you are. And so we'll say, why can't they do better? So what we want to create, and in this process help to understand, is that we want to explore and accept that we all have prejudices. We all do. When we acknowledge and accept that we have prejudices, it can allow us to be aware of how we interact with people and what we can do in those interactions to make sure that we create an environment where we're not insensitive, and we can build better relationships. And then we'll come to understand that, wow, by spending time with people, they're no different from me. Their families are just like mine. Their pains, their desires, their hurt, it's the same that I have. And so we'll create that sense of unity where we don't just talk about it, but we'll actually live it. There's a saying that many of you have heard, and I'll read it. And the reason I want to read this is that I want us to all remember that we're all one race, and what happens to one group, while it might not happen to us immediately, will eventually happen to us. We all breathe the same air. And says, first they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. As we live our lives, as we go through our journey, let's remember that we are called to be our brother's keeper. Every one of us, regardless of race, color, creed, whatever, we're our brother's keeper, and we all need to make sure that everyone is treated with dignity and respect. So, Wayne Dyer said, if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And I want to mention that because a lot of times we come to things with our own perspective, and we think that that's the only way I can look at things. But if you change the way you look at things, if you walk a mile in someone else's shoes, if you try to look at it from another person's perspective, it might not change what you believe, but it will broaden your perspective where you're able to have a greater understanding of where others are coming from. For example, take the number 6. We take that number, and depending on where we're sitting, we'll see a 6. But if you're sitting at the opposite end, you'll see a 9. Does it make you right or wrong? This slide shows how important it is to really be open to trying to understand and see each other's perspective. Depending on where we stand, it's either a 6 or a 9. So I really want to encourage everyone to try to see things from the other person's perspective. Other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times we're using the same words. We're saying the same things, but we're talking about something different. The person on the right is saying everything is changing. The person on the left is saying everything is changing, but they're not looking at the same thing. We need to remember that, because at times we do that. We say that we use the same words, but we're not talking about the same things. So these sessions are going to be challenging, they can be transformational, and they will help us to gain factual, historical awareness. So we hope that as you do, so what can you expect? Factual, historical awareness. It's going to challenge our assumptions and our stereotypes, but it can also help to bring interracial healing and transformation into our spheres of influences. So what will be required of us during these sessions? We ask that you bring a sense of humility and open-mindedness. You'll be hearing history that you may never have heard before. I ask that you listen and really hear each other. Ask for a willingness to trust each other. The purposes of this is to provide information. History you may never have heard, as I said. We ask for honest sharing. And we hope that through this process, we'll all have a more balanced perspective and judgment on things. So there'll be opportunities to comment, to ask questions. So here's a few ground rules that we want to bring. 1, we ask that you feel free to share openly and respectfully, even when sharing hard truths. Listen and be respectful to other people. It is okay to disagree, but please do not be disagreeable. Clearly state what you disagree with and why you disagree with it. No personal attacks, please. And while we have different political perspectives, let's try not to politicize our communications. So with that, as we have laid those ground rules and that framework, I want to say that the Pew Research in 2019 did a study on the current state of race relations in the US. And as is expected, it was discovered that many people are divided on the state of race relations. Republicans and Democrats differ widely on their views on racial progress in America. The public has a negative view of the country's racial progress. More than half of the country says that former President Trump has made race relations worse. Many Black adults have negative views about the country's racial progress. And many non-whites are more likely to see advantages in being white than those who are white. In addition, most Americans say that it's now more common for people to express racist or racially insensitive views and opinions. Blacks are far more likely than whites to say discrimination is a major obstacle for Black people. A majority of Black and white adults say that Blacks are treated less fairly than whites in dealings with the police and the criminal justice system. So, with that, I want you to have a few questions in your mind as you go through this and as you go through your day. I'm asking that this is not, you listen to it and then you watch it and then we go off and do our own things. Ask yourselves a question: why do you believe race relations are the way they are? And there is no one answer to that. There are multiple reasons. And will you use a one-dimensional, a multi-dimensional, or a binary perspective on the reasons for that? So now we've touched on what was presented by the Pew Research in their 2019 on the reasons on the state of race relations in the US. And so at this time, we're going to go back in history to the Reconstruction period to help us begin to pare back what has happened and how we got to where we are today. And with that, I'm going to bring Carol back to you. Thank you.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So I'm learning how to use this clicker. It's Lloyd's. Whoops, wrong way. So Reconstruction is a period in history books, that's bookended by the end of the Civil War in 1877, when the Northern troops pulled out of their occupation of the South. My contention, and many historians, I'm not a bona fide historian, is that Reconstruction did not end in 1877. And there's tremendous disagreement among scholars and people back then, at the time of Reconstruction, about whether or not, or to what extent, it was successful, and whether or not it was doomed to failure. So there's still that disagreement about what Reconstruction means and meant. Why learn about it? Well, there's a renewed interest in it. There are many scholars that are revisiting it. There's a wonderful new exhibit. Actually, it started in September at the Smithsonian Museum, the National Museum for African American History and Culture. And it's called, I had to write this down because I just found this out, Make Good the Promises: Reconstruction and Its Legacies. So, and again, it was Nicole that told me about that, so I had to go and look that up, and it's amazing. And if you go to our resources, we have maybe too many resources for you, but go to a couple of the links for that museum and navigate your way through their incredible website. I went to the museum myself in Washington, D.C., and it was amazing to be there in person, but I think that the website is just as good. And so, and you can navigate it yourself. You don't have to switch floors. It's really an amazing one. And the director of the African American Museum of History and Culture said that this is, and his name is Kevin Young. He said, this is an opportunity to make amends for the injustices of slavery and rebuild, reconstruct, itself on a new foundation of racial equity. There's been a lot of new scholarship. There are amazing educational programs online. Some of them are in our resource list, so please do check them out. But why learn about it? Because at this period of time, Black lives mattered. Not only do historians argue over whether it was successful or not, they argue over what was the intent of Reconstruction, what was its meaning, and what was its promise. It was then and now a time of great contradiction. It was a moment of tremendous promise, and it was a moment when formerly enslaved people responding to emancipation moved, and they set up schools, and they set up churches, and they built their communities, and the Black men voted, and they voted Black men into state legislatures, and a senator and several congressmen, I have a picture of them a little later on, went to the 41st and 42nd Congress in Washington, D.C. This is after 250 years of chattel slavery. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution makes slavery illegal. It abolishes it. And immediately, Black Americans sensed the freedom and moved. I'm going to cover a couple of important dates that show the promise of this time period. So in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in an unprecedented use of executive power. The response was immediate. Juneteenth is the celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln. In 1865, immediately at the end of the Civil War, when the South surrendered, the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution. And then the Civil Rights Act was legislated in 1866. The then president, Andrew Johnson, who was Abraham Lincoln's vice president, so when Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson becomes president, and he was an avowed racist, and he wanted to end Reconstruction before Congress even came back into session. And so Congress was worried that Johnson was going to have the Civil Rights Act declared unconstitutional. And so they quickly passed or put in place the 14th Amendment. For the Southern states to enter back and to be readmitted to the Union they had left when they seceded, they had to ratify both the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment confers, which is what the Civil Rights Act did, confers citizenship on the newly freed Black Americans. And it declares that the federal government will protect the privileges of being a citizen if you were born or naturalized in the United States. And it also says that no state shall abridge those privileges, meaning that the Southern states would not be allowed to take them away. What happened, I have to go back. What happened, though, is that there was an immediate, what historians call judicial retreat. So some people think that Reconstruction failed. One of the main reasons it failed was a judicial retreat. The Supreme Court had several decisions where they narrowed the definition of national citizenship so dramatically that it completely eroded the effectiveness of the 14th Amendment and the protection that newly freed Black people had in the Constitution. The 15th Amendment is where I'm going to focus a lot of this. It's called black suffrage. It gave the vote to eligible black males. And immediately, black people understood the importance of this. If you think about it, your basic civil right is your vote in a democracy. Each person gets one vote, and that was so important. Think of it. Very quickly, they had been enslaved, and then they were free, and then they could vote. And so this is part of the promise of Reconstruction, and it is significant. This too, eventually, when Reconstruction is over, and Lloyd is going to talk to you about this next week in much more detail, but home rule was reestablished, and very quickly, the black men who had been given the vote and had exercised that were disenfranchised. The vote was removed. What's really important is that black people be put at the center of their own history. And that sounds kind of obvious, but that has not been the case. A really eminent African-American scholar, W.E.B. Du Bois, wrote a book in 1935 called Black Reconstruction. And his subtitle is An Essay Toward a History of the Part Which Black Folk Played in the Attempt to Reconstruct Democracy in America, 1860 to 1880. In it, he says, the chief witness in Reconstruction, the emancipated slave himself, has been almost barred from court. His written Reconstruction record has been largely destroyed and nearly always neglected. Another prominent, and by the way, this book has been re-released. Two historians, Eric Foner, who is a Reconstruction scholar, he teaches at Columbia, and Henry Louis Gates, who is an African-American scholar of enormous repute, who teaches at Harvard, put together letters and communication that show Du Bois's inclination toward his book, Black Reconstruction. They've added it to the book. So not only have the printing in 1935, it has been reissued. Another example of why there's more attention now being paid to Reconstruction. Another prominent African-American scholar who, going back a bit from Du Bois, a man named Frederick Douglass, very active in the abolition movement, and he was a slave, and he wrote a book called Up from Slavery. And he made many speeches in the resources. There's one about his speech on the 4th of July and what it means to black people. You should read it. It's not that long, and he's a man of tremendous intellect and incredibly important in American history. And he said he believed that Reconstruction was a complete failure. And here's what he said. After thanking for the emancipation, he said, well, when you turned us loose, you gave us no acres, no land. You turned us loose to the sky, to the storm, to the whirlwind, and worst of all, you turned us loose to the wrath of our infuriated masters. Now, this reference to land, many historians believe that the major reason that Reconstruction failed is because there was no land redistribution. Initially, all of the acreage from the plantations was seized by the federal government, and so there was an opportunity to divide this up, and actually it happened a little bit over in Georgia, and then stopped, but it didn't end up happening. And so even though the people that were in charge of Reconstruction, called the Radical Republicans, wanted land redistribution, and they were setting up schools and doing job training, and they had that as one of their goals, but they didn't stay in the South very long. And the Vice President Johnson ended up pardoning the elite. He kind of liked it when they would come and ask to be pardoned, and he would say, yes, you're pardoned. And so they rather quickly were able to grab a hold of their power and status and land. This is hard to look at, but I put it here so that you would understand, you would have a visual of some of the horrors of slavery. So the photographs, photography was kind of new. Like in the Civil War, we have a lot of photographs of soldiers standing in front of tents, right? Dead bodies on the ground. Photography, but you had to stay still because the shutter speed was so slow. You'll see that in some of the pictures I'm going to show after this. But this man with his back scarred from being whipped and lashed, I mean, what kind of condition does your skin have to be in to scar like that? And then over here is an artist's illustration of enslaved people being moved. And you can see the attitude, the tone is very much for or sympathetic to the enslaved people. But it also shows these collars. I don't know if you can see on the one with the foreman and his whip is raised. The two black men on either side of him in the foreground have this incredible restraint on their necks. The woman has I don't know if you can see it, but with the small child, she has a metal collar, a thick metal collar, and attached to that are heavy chains that attaches to the restraints around the necks of the people in front and behind her. And the children, their hands are bound. So I wanted to show you that because even though we're not talking about slavery itself, we're talking about the Reconstruction period, it's important to know that during nearly 250 years of chattel slavery, that African Americans' ability to build and sustain community gave their lives, if you can imagine seeing those last two pictures, gave their lives dignity in the face of that horrible oppression that you just saw. And this is important to know. Of course, there was an immediate reaction to emancipation by an outraged white supremacist society. This was happening quickly. Black codes were instituted. Slavery had been declared illegal. It had been abolished. But what happened, the southern states put in place these pieces of legislation and policies that would control the newly freed African Americans movement, so that in many cases it was like keeping slavery, the restrictions of slavery, alive. Again, Lloyd's going to go into much more details about that. The other thing that happened during Reconstruction as part of this reaction by the white supremacist society is the establishment of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. And they were organized as a political terrorist organization. And they weren't just terrorizing newly freed black people, they were terrorizing Republicans. Now, at this point in time, the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln. It was the party that freed the slaves. It was the party that was in charge of Reconstruction and occupying the South. There were hundreds and hundreds, thousands of soldiers in the South to make sure that rights of newly freed blacks were not completely eroded. And they, when they left, home rule was immediately reestablished. But terrorism in the form of the KKK was all the way through Reconstruction. Here's a picture of the Klan, two guys posing for a picture in their hoods and with their weapons and their robes. And over here on the right-hand side is a very famous political cartoon. Cartoon doesn't mean funny. They were political in nature. And you can see that the sympathy is with every part of the picture is delivering the same message. And you can see, so the sympathy is with this African-American family, and the mother is cradling an infant in her arms, and her husband is next to her, and his hands are up around his head so that he won't get hurt. And they have been literally brought to their knees by a combination of the Ku Klux Klan and the White League. And at the top, I don't know if you can read it, there's the American Eagle, and it says, "The Union as it was. This is a white man's government." And then the two are joining hands across the skull and crossbones, and it says "the lost cause," which is a thing. It is actually still alive, very alive in our country today. And then you can probably see where it says worse than slavery. So the idea that during Reconstruction, this terrorism and that it was worse than slavery. And you can also see in the background a tree with a lynched man hanging from the branches. Strange Fruit is a song. I should have put that in the resources. I should put some music in the resources. And then there's a schoolhouse that's fallen apart and a book in the foreground. So this is also, I was just thinking, I got married in 1973, and my husband and I drove down to South Carolina, 1973, in the car. And when you're going through rural areas, you'll have an interstate, and then parallel to the interstate will be a dirt road out in the country. And we're driving down a 95, and on the side of this dirt road was a huge billboard. It was old, it was sort of broken and chipped in places, but it said, "Welcome to the heart of Klan country." This is 1973. Help fight integration and communism. And it had a Klansman with his hood on a white steed up on its hind legs and little crosses on the hillside. And I remember I got out to take a picture of it because I couldn't believe it. And my husband said, "Get back in the car." This picture I've included, this is clearly a modern picture. This is an African-American man dressed in the clothing of a slave with the real, actual implements that were used to restrain the collars. And I can't help but think this is intentional. This is the legacy, right? This is the legacy of slavery. This is a man today. So what did freedom mean? They knew what freedom was, even if the enslaved people had never experienced it. One of the letters that I love, the primary document, was a mistress. So people just up and left. They didn't even legally own the clothes on their back, but their desire to move, they moved off of plantations. And they were searching for family, and they were just moving because they could move, because they could go. And this one letter by this plantation mistress was writing about this, and she was upset. Her feelings were hurt that they hadn't bothered to say goodbye. This is an example of it was in Harper's Weekly, which was a publication at the time, and this is of the Freedmen's Bureau. This is a Union man, officer, who was in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau, one of them, and you can tell that he is also sympathetic to the artist, to the Black cause, because you have the American flag backdrop on this man who's standing there so certain, he's so certain of what he's doing, and he's holding back the white supremacists. Two of them have their knives drawn, and he is got his hand here to protect the newly freed Black men. Freedom, what did it mean? I'm just going to show you these pictures, okay? This picture's from a little bit later. You can tell by the length of the skirts, but it's still in the 19th century. And it still shows the support of the African-American family was so important. I love this picture. Look at the expression on that man's face. And he had to hold really still. So the smile seems like it's just in the moment, but to take those pictures required being very, very still. And I love this picture of these boys outside of the school, and the one in the front. Look at his expression. This is a picture posed of one of the Freedmen Bureau schools for African Americans. And they have their books, and they're poised with their books. This education was huge. Another picture. I'm going to look a little bit at the 15th Amendment quickly. This is a poster that was made at the time of the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote. And quickly, just coming down the left side, this was a standard way of doing a poster with all these little subtopics around and a central picture. And here you can see the parades and just people, endless lines of people out celebrating. But starting up here, there's a man with a red vest, and he is reading the Emancipation Proclamation. How do I know this? I got a magnifying glass out, and I looked at down at the bottom where you see all this printing, that it says on this poster what each thing was. I'm not going to go through every single one, but if you drop down to this open book, that's the Holy Scripture, the Bible, which was very important for African Americans in both during slavery and afterward. Down here at the lower left-hand corner is a school, and it says that this education was going to make the races equal. It says that down here. And then marriage. They could marry in public. And then here, moving over to the right, elected legislators in Congress, in state Congress, making laws, doing work. And then coming up the side, we will fight for a country that defends our rights. And then here, too, a man standing with wheat behind him, I guess, and that is, it said, to till our land, which they didn't get. Right here, over here, there's a head, Abraham Lincoln, and over here, John Brown. I don't know if you know the story about John Brown, but he organized a raid. He was funded by Northern abolitionists and organized a raid on Harper's Ferry in Virginia. It didn't go well. He didn't get all the slaves behind him that he hoped to. He was captured. He went on trial. He was he was executed. He was hung. I'm going to quickly go through a few of these. This is a primary document from the time period, and it shows an orderly line of Black men from all walks of life lining up to cast their vote. And the tone of this is the man in front who is putting his vote in has taken his hat off. And the white man who is overseeing this, even the white man is solemnly approving of this. There's a tremendous dignity to this picture. I'll go through these quickly. This is the first, as it says, I'm reading, the first colored senator and representatives. I had mentioned this earlier. They elected to office at the beginning of Reconstruction. And these are also posters, too, if you can see the number of Black faces. This one is for South Carolina, and this one is Louisiana. So we have put in the live chat 2 Google Forms, if you want to take a look. And they're activities for you. Because we're not in person, we can't really go back and forth like Lloyd was suggesting. Lloyd is very sad that we're not in person. But they are to promote social imagination, which is critical in developing a respect for voices of the past, in developing compassion and imagining yourselves. Lloyd talked about putting yourself in their shoes. Howard Zinn, famous historian, said, and this is important, when we look only at what happened, it can make history seem inevitable. But history is full of choice points. There are always alternatives. And he believed that looking carefully at Reconstruction can alert us to some of the most significant could-have-beens in our country's history. W.E. Du Bois, in his subtitle of his book, implied the same thing. So the questions that you're going to be asked on the Google form on the first one is, how would you feel in 1865 if you were a formerly enslaved person? There's no correct answer. You would know what you're up against, right? You wouldn't be out dancing in the street and not worried about your safety, but you would understand what freedom meant, and you would understand what you're up against. How would you feel? And what we're asking you to do is, if you choose to answer this, and it can be short, please use first person. Use I, me, my. You would be amazed. It might seem a little weird at first, but you would be amazed at what that triggers inside you. And the second one is, what if formerly enslaved people had a say in Reconstruction? That could have happened. It's a could have been. So you're a member of a delegation of African Americans who are going to Congress with suggestions of what should happen to reconstruct democracy in America. There was a moment, and there are some specific questions like who should be able to vote, and what should you do with the confiscated land? So you can add items to that, and we would really like it if you would. You don't have to fill them all out. They're not required fields. These are anonymous. We would like to start next Wednesday by me reading some of the responses that we get. So it'll be embarrassing if I don't have anything to read. So Reconstruction ends in 1877 when Northern troops pull out of the South. Home rule is immediately established. Jim Crow laws go into effect. And segregation of the races is achieved. Disenfranchisement happens. The voting, lynchings on the rise. Some people have called 1877 to 1920 the nadir, the bottom point of the African American experience in this country. And sharecropping, which Lloyd is going to talk to you about in great detail next week. But I don't think Reconstruction ended in 1877. There was too much promise at the beginning. And wasn't the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century, wasn't that reconstructing our society? And what about now? What about now? What about Black Lives Matter? Is that not an attempt to reconstruct our society? And what about student activist groups pressing school administrations? They want to learn about Black history, they want to read Black authors, and they want to acquire an historical awareness of race. And what about you? Why did you sign up to watch this? So I don't think Reconstruction ended in 1877. I think that it continues today. And to close, Lloyd is coming back to talk to you. I'll hang out over on this side. Do you have a prop? Oh, your microphone.
Hi, great job, Carol. Thank you. So, Maya Angelou said, it is time for parents to teach young people early on that in diversity there is beauty and there is strength. Carol just went through the Reconstruction, touched on the Reconstruction period. And the Reconstruction period actually came about because of the 13th Amendment being passed, which, and I'll say technically, freed enslaved people. I have it on the screen, and it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction. And that allowed for the opportunity for people of color, formerly enslaved people, to vote, to be voted for to enter into Congress and serve, to pass laws that were helpful, beneficial, not just to the Black community, but to the entire community, society as a whole. It's interesting that when we think of public education, and if you really peel back the onion and you go back in history, you'll realize that it was through great effort of many people of color who fought for the right for public education that the public school system became what it did. Unfortunately, not too long after this period ended, many of these black people who fought for this were prevented from participating in the school system. But it was the 13th Amendment that started this whole process to give these rights to people. But there's one clause, and we'll get into it more next week. And it says, it's that clause that says, except as a punishment for crime. When you read this and you just read through it straight, and when I was first thought about it, the 13th Amendment, we're often told it freed enslaved people, it freed the slaves. But laws, when they're written, if they are not written properly, they can create loopholes that can be exploited by others. And that's what happened. Now, you know, when you look back, one of the things I want, and I said it earlier, and I want to reiterate, talking about black people in history, because a lot of times, and I do it, we say this is black history. But if we really think about it, it's really just about black people in American history. It's not black history. It's just a little bit of focus on black people in American history. And so when we think about it and when we do that, history is complicated, as Carol said. It's complex. We look at ourselves. If we look at ourselves, we're complex beings. You know, my family, they'll see one side of me and they'd love that side of me, and another time they'll see that side of me and it's like, who is that? And if we look back and, you know, at so many people, and there are many people who some people look at and they say, okay, this is a great person in history. Another person sees another side of that person, and we are saying, not so fast. And I think what we have to do is, if we want to have show the full picture of that person, and allow people to be able to see, okay, this person did some great things, but they did not do some great things on this side. So the 13th Amendment, as I said, was a really great, and it did some good things, but there were some side effects that were negative that resulted from that. So one of the things we're going to do, and I think I'm going to ask Nicole to send it out probably in a link so that you'll have it over the next week so you can watch it. I would ask that everyone watch the documentary. It's called Slavery by Another Name. It's over an hour, but what we're going to do right now, we're going to take about 5 minutes to show you a trailer of Slavery by Another Name, and then we'll send the link so that you can watch the full documentary and have a broader view.
Buried
so that
in old
next
courthouses,
week,
abandoned
as we're talking
jails,
about it,
libraries,
you'll be able to
all across the South
understand where we're coming
tens
from.
of thousands of public documents and letters written by African Americans at the turn of the last century.
Mr. President, I have a brother about 14 years old. A man hired him from me and I heard of him no more. He went and sold him to McGree, and they's been working him in prison for 12 months. He's done nothing wrong for them to keep him in chains.
Written more than 40 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, these letters bear witness to a sinister and little-known chapter in American history.
Whenever one is in a conversation where someone says, what's wrong with black people? Why can't they get over it? Slavery ended 150 years ago. That's fundamentally false. The reality is that slavery and all of the limitations that it imposed on the future and the potential and the progress of African American families. It didn't end 150 years ago. It continued until World War II, well into the lives of large numbers of African Americans today.
For more than 80 years following the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of African Americans in the South were pulled back into the shadow of slavery.
Buying and selling African Americans ended with the 13th Amendment, but that did not translate into actual freedom.
One of the fascinating things about the text of that amendment is that it says that slavery is abolished, except in the case of a punishment for a crime.
With emancipation, the nature of both crime and punishment in the South changed dramatically. In state after state, county after county, laws were passed to criminalize black life.
It was a crime in the South for a farm worker to walk beside a railroad. It was a crime in the South to speak loudly in the company of white women. It was a crime to sell the products of your farm after dark. But the most damaging of all of these laws were the vagrancy statute. In every southern state, you became a criminal if you could not prove at any given moment that you were employed.
Once arrested, convicts were leased and forced to labor in coal mines, lumber camps, brick factories, and turpentine farms. They were shackled, imprisoned, and tortured, sometimes to the point of death.
The fact that blacks were treated the way they were, like animals. People could be just picked up and put in jail. They could be lost in the system. Nobody knew how to find them. They could be buried in some grave somewhere and families still looking for them. Don't know where they are. I didn't know that the sheriff department could sell slaves to corporations, steel plants, and coal mines.
The constant threat of arrest and forced labor, like the threat of lynching, cast a shadow over the South. Slavery had ended, but true freedom had not begun.
It continued until World War II, well into the lives of large numbers of African Americans today.
For more than 80 years following the Civil War.
Okay, so that's just a portion of the clip that will be of the documentary that will be sent out.
Homework.
Yes, homework for everyone. Now, I just want to make it clear that when we talk about black people in American history, we're not doing it to say America is the worst place or such a bad place. Like I said, there are two sides and some bad things happen. What I want us to do is to be able to see what happened, see how we've contributed to where things are today, and what we can do, how we can do things to make sure that we don't repeat what has happened in the past. Let's talk about Reconstruction. Great progress was made after slavery. But what happened after that? It all fell apart. And the lives of so many black people were just destroyed. I have a friend who liked to say, "You're better than that." And I would like to say, America, we're better than that. We don't want history to repeat itself. We're living in times where if we don't remember our history, then we are more than likely going to repeat it. As a person of color, I don't want to see that repeated and for black people to go through that. As a matter of fact, I don't want to see anybody have to go through what happened, how people were treated, how people of color were treated during this period after Reconstruction. We are a great nation. We can do things that will turn things around, uplift people, make it a great country for everyone, not just for a few. And that's what we want, that's what we desire, is to see people from all walks of life, race, color, creed, national origin, whatever it is, to see everyone have that opportunity to realize the dream that Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence stated, that for, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'd like to see everyone have that, wherever you're coming from. And if someone chooses not to take advantage of that, then it's on them. So let's seek how we can make that happen. And so with that, I think we're going to wrap up this week. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this presentation. I want to thank those of you who are here for really being here to encourage and support us. And I want to thank Simsbury Community TV for hosting this. And Carol, thank you so much again for your participation. And everyone, thank you and have a great evening.
See you next week.
We'll see you next week, same time. Thank you.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.